Money and sports became the two golden idols of the time. So the last video kind of cut off, so I'm going to start from this paragraph. Millions of people invested in the stock market trying to strike it rich, and the market kept smashing all previous records. Everyone, it seemed, was playing the market: shoeshine men, bus drivers, housewives, maids, butlers, even ministers. One newspaper reported that 4 out of every 5 people who rode trolley cars were reading stock reports, and virtually every small city in the country had a brokerage house. America's prosperity was so rampant, all rules of logic were broken. People reasoned. Every crash in the past has been followed by a recovery. The market can only go up, therefore there's no reason to sell. I'll just buy and hold on. In 1929, however, the Standard Trade and Securities Service began to sense that the market was headed for trouble. At one point, they issued a stern warning. A handful of business leaders also awakened to the crisis, and they tried to sound an alarm about a possible crash. Several ministers joined in, denouncing America's widespread greed and prophesying that God was about to judge the country for its sins. But the vast majority of experts responded, "Be bullish on America. Prosperity is here to stay. Just keep investing and spending." One writer of the time summed up America's vision of the future with these words: "We are a country free from poverty and hardship. We have new science, new prosperity, roads crowded with millions of new automobiles. Airplanes are filling the skies. Lines of high-tension wires flow hilltop to hilltop with power to give information to 1,000 labor-saving machines. Skyscrapers rise above one-time villages. Vast cities are rising up in great masses of stone and concrete and are roaring with incredibly mechanized traffic. And smartly dressed men and women are spending the money they have won in the market." Americans ignored the few voices of reason who advised caution and just kept spending. Then the inevitable happened. On September 3rd, 1929, the market began to crack. Something was wrong, and everybody in America knew it. Margin buyers suddenly began fleeing the market. Yet even after this omen, economic soothsayers raised a loud voice to try to calm the panic. The Harvard Economic Society announced, "This is just a period of readjustment, a much-needed market correction. This is not the beginning of a depression." An expert named Professor Fisher declared, "Within a few months, the market will rebound and go higher." President Hoover echoed the feelings of most financial observers. "America's industrial situation is absolutely sound. Our factories are humming, business is healthy, the economy is in good condition. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with our underlying business and credit structure. It's a good time to buy stock." One newspaper published this headline on October 16, 1929. "American business is too big and diversified, and the country too rich to be influenced by stock fluctuations." Doesn't this kind of reassurance sound familiar? Finally, on Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the American stock market crashed to the ground. Utter fear and panic struck by noon that day. The leading stocks just kept falling, and this time there were no bargain hunters, investment buyers, or big operators looking to buy back their own stock. Instead, all across the country, people swarmed into their local brokers' offices, desperate to sell at any price. But there simply were no buyers. The exchange system couldn't cope with the masses trying to sell, and within 8 short hours, the party was over. President Hoover tried to reassure the nation, but his words had little effect. The communication system of America were jammed by the voices of sellers only, with no buyers in sight. Panic hit the foreign nations. All across the world, people were stunned, shocked, and fearful at the news that the great economy of America had suddenly fallen. In every town and village in the United States, families were cast into poverty, having lost their paper wealth. Soon, suicides were being reported in areas all over the nation. The Great Depression had begun. Consider what one writer said of the crash's aftermath. "There was hardly a man or woman in the country whose attitude toward life had not been affected by it to some degree. Hope was suddenly shattered. With the market in shambles and prosperity folding, Americans were soon to find themselves living in a different world. Everything changed. Day by day, the newspapers printed the grim reports of suicides. The Deep Depression lasted for nearly a decade. What brought down the stock market in 1929? What was it exactly that shook America and the world during that time, turning prosperity into poverty overnight? What brought on that worldwide depression? Simply put, it was the Lord. It was the same God who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for their sins, the same God who judged Israel for its idolatry, bringing Titus's army down on Jerusalem to destroy it, the same God who promises in Revelation to wipe out the prosperity of Babylon in a single hour, the same God who has been warning America about its sin for years through the voices of prophets who cry out with grieving, broken hearts. Yes, America is a modern Babylon, and God's message to Babylon is this: Thou sayest, I shall be a lady forever, so that thou didst not lay these things to thy heart, neither didst remember the latter end of it. Therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection, for the multitude of thy sorceries, and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, None seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge it hath perverted thee, and thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. Therefore evil shall come upon thee. Thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. Isaiah 47, 7-11. We have conveniently chosen to ignore the lessons of God's judgment on Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem, Sodom, Babylon, and all other failed empires. And now, just over half a century, we have totally forgotten the lessons God tried to teach us in the Great Depression of the 30s, a judgment that crippled our nation and the whole world. God was saying to us then, flagrant sin is a reproach to any nation, and so you must never forget how your country provoked me to wrath a generation ago. I'd given you power to obtain wealth and become prosperous so you could be a great missionary nation. But you quickly forgot me, the source of all your blessings. Therefore, I laid your nation low, humbling your proud markets and causing the rich to become poor. Remember that day, America. Consider what I did to the past generation, and don't make the same mistakes. Has this nation learned anything from its past? Have our government leaders considered God's historical judgments on wicked nations? No, they have ignored them all. It's very clear the nations of the world today are making the same mistakes that brought down God's wrath upon every sinful society in the past. And yet, by all indications, every nation, including America, is continuing its path of godlessness, oblivious to God's warnings and judgments on all sides. Our leaders seem completely ignorant of the lessons of history, having no regard for the Lord's past dealings with sinful humankind. Instead, they're behaving like madmen, as if there isn't a God in heaven who will bring them to account. By contrast, Moses commanded Israel to remember all of God's past dealings with their nation. Quote, Thou shalt well remember what the Lord thy God did unto Pharaoh and unto all Egypt. Deuteronomy 7:18. Remember and forget not how thou provokedst the Lord thy God to wrath in the wilderness, so that the Lord was angry with you to have destroyed you. Deuteronomy 9:7-8. Thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth. Deuteronomy 8:18. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water. who brought thee forth out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. Deuteronomy 8:11 and 15 through 16. God was warning his people, look back and remember how well I dealt with your sinful ancestors. I judged them in my wrath, reducing them to poverty, sending depression and deprivation